73 miles of blood-soaked mud stretch beyond the tree line, where 80,000 hardened legionnaires stand freezing in the driving rain, waiting for a command that will alter the trajectory of human civilization forever. This is not just a battle. It is the brutal, violent climax of a machine built to devour the known world. At its absolute zenith, this sprawling superpower holds 50 million souls in its iron grip, accounting for roughly 20% of the global population, dictating everything from the bread they eat to the gods they fear. Yet beneath the marble columns, the triumphant arches, and the seemingly invincible military formations, a terminal cancer of corruption, ego, and systemic overreach is already eating away at the foundation. Let's step back into the shadows of the most colossal geopolitical paradox in human history, an empire that engineered unparalleled marvels of urban planning and legal philosophy, while simultaneously fueling an insatiable appetite for genocide, enslavement, and theatrical slaughter. The inception of this continent-spanning juggernaut does not begin with glistening architecture or divine mandates, but in the disease-ridden swamps of a central Italian peninsula in the 8th century BCE. It starts as an insignificant cluster of mud huts, populated by outcasts, fugitives, and opportunistic raiders who cling to the hills to survive the brutal tribal warfare of the region. They have no standing army, no written laws, and no vast wealth, but they possess a ruthless pragmatism that will become their defining genetic trait. Early on, they are ruled by foreign kings, enduring a humiliating subjugation that eventually sparks a vicious, blood-soaked rebellion. When they finally eject their monarchs, they swear a sacred oath never to be ruled by a single sovereign again, constructing a radically experimental system of governance. They draft complex legal codes, establish a sprawling senate, and create a system of checks and balances designed specifically to prevent the rise of a tyrant. But this noble political experiment is immediately compromised by an aggressive paranoia. Surrounded by hostile neighbors, their philosophy rapidly evolves into a doctrine of preemptive annihilation. If a neighboring tribe poses even a theoretical threat, the response is overwhelming and total war. The Republic begins to expand, not initially out of a grand design for empire, but through a series of paranoid, hyperviolent buffer wars. Every conquered territory requires another buffer zone to protect it, creating a self-perpetuating engine of endless expansion. To fuel this engine, they completely restructure their society around the military. Citizenship becomes inextricably linked to military service. The plow and the sword become the dual symbols of their identity. They suffer catastrophic defeats in these early days, including having their capital entirely sacked and burned to the ground by invading northern tribes, an event that inflicts a deep generational trauma. Instead of breaking them, this humiliation acts as a dark catalyst. They rebuild their walls higher, drill their soldiers harder, and systematically eliminate every rival on the peninsula. By the time they lock eyes with a maritime superpower across the sea, initiating a century-long, multi-generational conflict that will see fleets of hundreds of warships destroyed and hundreds of thousands of men slaughtered, they are no longer just a resilient city-state. They have transformed into an apex predator, a culture that fundamentally refuses to accept surrender, willing to absorb unfathomable casualties until their enemies simply break under the weight of sheer attrition. But brute force alone does not conquer a continent. To hold a territory that spans from the rain-swept moors of the north to the scorching deserts of the south requires an unprecedented leap in logistical engineering and organizational psychology. Let's tear down the blueprint of the ultimate military machine. They do not just march into foreign lands, they bring their entire civilization with them. A single legion consisting of 5,000 heavy infantrymen operates as a self-sustaining mobile city. At the end of every exhausting day of marching, regardless of the weather or the proximity of the enemy, these men lay down their weapons and pick up shovels. Within exactly 3 hours, they excavate massive ditches, erect impenetrable timber palisades, and construct a perfectly symmetrical fortified camp. This psychological warfare terrifies their enemies, who watch from the hills as an impregnable fortress materializes out of thin air every single night. This obsession with order and infrastructure becomes the true weapon of their dominance. They pour millions of tons of volcanic ash, lime, and seawater into wooden molds to create a revolutionary building material that hardens underwater, allowing them to construct massive artificial harbors and sprawling aqueduct networks that defy gravity. These aqueducts, meticulously angled at a drop of mere inches per mile, transport millions of gallons of fresh water directly into the hearts of their cities, enabling unprecedented population densities. And connecting it all is a staggering network of 50,000 miles of paved, all-weather roads. These are not mere dirt paths. They are highly engineered, multi-layered highways cutting straight through mountains and swamps, designed primarily for the hyperfast deployment of military force. A courier can travel up to 150 miles in a single day using a complex relay system of fresh horses, allowing the central command to react to border incursions with terrifying speed. If you love uncovering the forgotten empires of our past and the mechanical secrets that made them unstoppable, make sure to subscribe. We unearth stories like this every week. Returning to the battlefield, this vast logistical web allows a relatively small number of soldiers to police millions of conquered subjects. But the wealth pouring into the capital from these crushed nations acts as a toxic narcotic on the political elite. The influx of enslaved millions annihilates the middle-class farming foundation of the republic, creating a vast, angry underclass. The politicians, previously restrained by tradition, begin to utilize weaponized populism, buying the loyalty of massive private armies rather than the state. This culminates in a shattering civil war. A brilliantly ruthless general, commanding fiercely loyal veterans who have spent a decade committing systematic genocide in the northern forests, decides to ignore the fundamental law of the republic. He crosses a shallow, insignificant boundary river with his troops, effectively declaring war on his own government. The ensuing bloodbath obliterates the ancient republican system entirely. When the dust settles, the illusion of a senate remains, but absolute power is now consolidated in the hands of a single, unassailable autocrat. The empire is officially born not through a mandate of the people, but through the overwhelming application of military violence directed inward. Under this new imperial model, the borders expand even further, driven by the ego of men who demand military triumphs to solidify their domestic political standing. They annex ancient desert kingdoms, stripping them of their immense grain wealth to feed the bloated, restless population of the capital. They orchestrate staggering public spectacles, flooding massive stone arenas with water to stage mock naval battles, or importing tens of thousands of exotic apex predators from the African continent merely to be slaughtered in front of screaming, blood-drunk crowds. This psychological conditioning, providing free bread and endless hyperviolent entertainment, becomes the fundamental mechanism of domestic control, keeping the impoverished masses docile while the elite extract unimaginable wealth from the provinces. Yet behind the gleaming marble facades and the propaganda of a perpetual golden age, a terrifying structural decay is taking root, completely invisible to the cheering crowds in the amphitheaters. The very systems that built the empire are now cannibalizing it. Let's examine the hidden reality of this sprawling behemoth. First, the political succession is a lethal, unregulated nightmare. Because the empire was born from a military coup masked as a restoration of the republic, there is no official, legal mechanism for transferring power. It relies entirely on the raw backing of the military and the elite Praetorian Guard. If an emperor fails to pay his guards a massive enough bribe, or shows a moment of weakness, he is simply assassinated. At one point, the highest office in the world is literally auctioned off to the highest bidder by mutinous guardsmen, destroying any remaining shred of institutional legitimacy. This perpetual instability triggers a catastrophic domino effect across the economy. To fund the endless civil wars and the massive, expanding bureaucracy required to manage 50 million people, emperors begin to quietly debase the currency. They systematically reduce the silver content of their primary coin, replacing it with cheap bronze, while aggressively minting more money to pay the bloated military. This triggers a runaway hyperinflation crisis that destroys the savings of the middle class and paralyzes long-distance trade. At the same time, the fundamental engine of their wealth, perpetual conquest, grinds to a halt. The empire reaches its natural geographic limits. Beyond the northern rivers are impenetrable, freezing forests filled with highly decentralized guerrilla fighters. To the east, a heavily armored, sophisticated rival empire capable of matching their tactical brilliance. Without a constant influx of newly conquered gold and enslaved labor, the economic model shatters. Taxes become so oppressively high that citizens actively flee their homes and join barbarian tribes just to escape the vicious tax collectors. The elite retreat to massive, self-sustaining rural estates, fortifying their walls and refusing to participate in the civic structure, laying the very early invisible foundations for medieval feudalism. Furthermore, unseen biological and ecological disasters begin to strike. A devastating, unknown pandemic, likely an early strain of smallpox, sweeps through the trade networks, annihilating perhaps a quarter of the population and severely depleting the military manpower pool. They are forced to actively recruit foreign mercenaries to man the borders, the very tribes they once considered inferior savages. These mercenaries have no loyalty to the abstract idea of the empire. Their loyalty is strictly to the coin. The psychological armor of the civilization is cracking. The water flowing through the lead-lined pipes of the wealthy elites is slowly poisoning their nervous systems, contributing to rampant paranoia and erratic decision-making at the highest levels of government. The sprawling megastructure has become too heavy, too corrupt, and too terrifyingly complex for any single human mind to manage. As the borders finally buckle under the synchronized pressure of desperate, migrating confederations and highly organized eastern invasions, the western half of this geopolitical titan collapses in a slow, agonizing suffocation rather than a sudden explosion. But the true terror and the ultimate brilliance of this empire is that it never entirely vanished. It simply mutated. uploading its source code into the absolute fabric of the modern world. Every time a contemporary politician stands in a domed legislative chamber, every time a lawyer cites a precedent in a high court, and every time a modern general studies logistics and the projection of rapid military force, they are operating on the ghostly, optimized algorithms designed by men in tunics 2,000 years ago. The structural DNA of their aqueducts dictated the water management of the Industrial Revolution. Their language birthed half the modern tongues spoken across the globe today, and their eventual, highly calculated adoption of an obscure monotheistic religion completely restructured the geopolitical and cultural reality of the Western Hemisphere for the next 2 millennia. The collapse of their central authority plunged a continent into localized darkness, yet the ghosts of their legal frameworks remained, hoarded by monks and rediscovered centuries later to ignite the fires of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. We live essentially in the fragmented, highly evolved ruins of their ambition. To study this staggering, multi-century arc of triumph and catastrophic hubris is to look into a mirror reflecting the fundamental trajectory of human civilization. It forces us to ask terrifying questions about our own sprawling networks, our own complex economies, and the illusion of our own permanence. The boundaries between order and chaos are razor-thin, and even the most seemingly invincible superstructures can rot silently from the inside out while the masses cheer for the spectacle. If analyzing the hidden mechanics of the world's most powerful entities and decoding the ghosts of history that still dictate our modern lives fascinates you, hit that subscribe button. We will keep excavating the truth, dissecting the shadows, and challenging everything you thought you knew about the architects of our reality.